Right, thanks, Mary, and good afternoon. So, yeah, my name is Douglas Farish. I'm the Office Senior Partner in Edinburgh for Deloitte. I'm also the Head of Tax in Scotland. I'm delighted to echo Mary's welcome to the first post-COVID and hybrid event, and really good to see both a good number in the room and many more I can see online. We're delighted. We've been supporting the Fraser Allander commentary for about 6 years now, and we've been delighted to do that. It's such a great institution providing analysis and insight to leaders of all business types. As ever, I mean, it's not an easy time trying to forecast what's going on based on the analysis of what's behind. But what I do enjoy about working with Fraser Allander is their ability to take I'll make up billions of data sets, distill it down to something that is understandable, manageable, and then also consider future impact. Now, I'm going to introduce the other speakers of the Mary. So we've got John Ireland with us, Chief Executive of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. John joined the Fiscal Commission as Chief Exec in May 2017. Before he became a civil servant, working in the UK and Scottish economic modelling, London and Glasgow. He also had a spell at the Fraser of Allander Institute up to 2002 as director. We've got Greg Thwaites, Research Director at the Resolution Foundation, an independent think tank focusing on improving living standards on those of low to middle income. He works part-time as an Associate Professor at the University of Nottingham School of Economics. He's been the Head of International Research at Bank of England. You've also worked for the United Nations Mission in Kosovo and the Independent Commission on Banking and many things. We'll also be joined by Emma Congreve, the Deputy Director of the Fraser Allander Institute. She leads the analysis on poverty, inequality, and inclusive growth, something that I'm sure is dear to everyone's hearts here. So it's back to me. Now, I was promised as sponsor I get 5 minutes. What Mary doesn't know, the last time I managed to stop at 5 minutes was about 50 years ago. Anyway, just a few messages from my lines. Hopefully inflation is largely peaked, and yet it is close to a multi-decade high. I mean, I can remember the early 90s, not everyone will do. The Bank of England, however, are going to need some convincing that things are stable enough not to look at further rate rises. As Mary will no doubt cover, we're looking at entering into recession as demand, inflation, interest rates continue to put pressure. But with the resilience at the end of last year, the hope is that that is relatively shallow and short. Resilience of labour market, now that is something that troubles me. So the study looks at the fact that unemployment is at a really low level, and that's common though with many periods just before recession. But there is a large amount of inactive economic inactivity, and there are many job vacancies that can't get filled. Some 80% of businesses in Scotland recently reported they're struggling to fill vacancies, whether a lack of skills or experience or just people. We do a quarterly FO study around the UK, and that sentiment's absolutely echoed there. 60% of them in December were saying that they expect to reduce recruitment because of the headwinds, but reduce it does not mean none, and therefore they're going to struggle to fill those spaces they do want. A third rate the labour shortage as the greatest and most severe headwind for their business. You can look at things like job matching, concentrating on upskilling, but how does that feed more junior positions or different industries? High energy costs are, of course, of utmost concern, and we're heading towards the end of the first support, and we'll be looking forward to April as the new support measures come into play. Now, I might have mentioned that I'm a tax guy. I'm not going to talk too much in tax. Hopefully, again, Mary will cover that. But we are seeing an increasing divergence in tax rates between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And it's quite interesting in the analysis, you see they talk about the erosion of the headline income that could be made by behavioural changes. Now, not all behavioural changes will inhibit growth, but some might. What a difficult balancing act to get that revenue raising right with not inhibiting growth. I'm going to end on two more positive topics. So looking forward to the future, something we're all passionate about, that inclusive growth. We hosted an event with about 70 leaders across third, private and public sector in November called Shaping the Future Economic Landscape of Scotland. The energy in the room, the desire to do something and take it forward, notwithstanding what we're seeing, was palpable. So I'm really optimistic about that. And then notwithstanding challenges ahead, some companies will react and regress. If you do that too quickly without thinking about the future, you might have to do that in extreme cases. But for most, I would suggest that you take a pause for a moment, think about readying yourself for what's ahead, but with that future eye and getting back to growth and success. Anyway, enough for me, Mary.
Thank you very much for that, Douglas. And just to reassure people who have joined online that we do have our other panelists here. They're just not on the stage yet, so it's not just going to be me with two empty chairs. So they are here, and we'll get their thoughts after I do a brief run through a brief set of slides, just to show you what the main messages are from the commentary. The commentary is available for you to have a look at on our website. So as ever, we welcome feedback from the content of the commentary. And what we should be focusing on in future editions. There's so much data out there about the UK, global, Scottish economies. We can only cover so much in each edition. So, as ever, we look at the latest position of the Scottish economy. Where are we now? And in the recent years, that's been very much focusing on where we are compared to pre-pandemic. But we also, as well as analyse that data, we reflect on particular policy areas. And in this edition, we've reflected on the Scottish budget in December. We wrote a lot initially when the budget first came out. But this is a more considered reflection on the policies that were announced by the Scottish Government on the 15th of December. This one's a little bit later than we would normally have done due to the proximity of the budget to Christmas. But we'll get back on our normal schedule, and we'll be doing one at the end of March. And given that the UK budget's on the 15th of March, there'll be a lot of focus on the announcements in that, and also the new forecast by the OBR. So I can see there's already questions coming in from the online people who are watching the webinar today. So please keep them coming, you guys online, and we'll obviously take questions from in the room as well. Once we're finished hearing from the panel. So the big question really, compared to what we were saying at our last commentary in October, was, are we actually in a recession? We felt then, as many forecasters and commentators did, that probably quarter 3 of 2022 was the beginning of a recession, which may last, something like 5 quarters. And the Bank of England in November, at that time, we're saying maybe 8 quarters the recession would last. However, the monthly movements that we've seen in GDP data since then, quite a depressed picture in September, perhaps linked to shutdowns associated with the Queen's death and the mourning period, and then quite a big bounce back in October from that lower point, probably mean that what we'll see is a contraction in quarter 3 of 2022, when the data are sort of more final, and then a slight uptick in quarter 4, which means technically that won't be the start of the recession. So it's likely, and the Bank of England forecast that we released last week reflects this sort of picture, that the recession will actually start in quarter 1 of 2023 instead. Interestingly, well, I think it's interesting, the data for November for the UK showed very slight growth, for Scotland showed very slight contraction. But really, we shouldn't get too fixated on the fact that those are either side of zero. They're very close to each other. And we all know that the initial data points will get revised probably quite heavily. Having said that, Friday is quite exciting this week because we will get the first data for December for the UK. So that will tell us, at least at first go, what the ONS think about whether we are likely to be in recession already, or if we're waiting for quarter 1 for the recession to start. However, whether it's technically a recession starting quarter 3, quarter 4, or quarter 1, we're not in great economic times. And essentially the economy is sort of bumping around just at that pre-pandemic level at the moment. And it's not, we've not seen the catch up we all hope to see in 2022 for many reasons, which we have rehearsed, obviously, in terms of geopolitical factors and the high inflationary environment. So inflation does continue to dominate all economic and fiscal discussions. We are getting asked about it constantly and the impact it's having, both on the economy more broadly, but also the delivery of public services and therefore the sort of fiscal environment for government spending. Generally, expectations are for headline CPI inflation to go down to 3 or 4% by the end of 2023. We've sort of been asked how that's going to feel for people. Is that going to mean things are going to start to feel better for households as we move through 2023? And we have to keep emphasising that just because inflation is coming down to 3 or 4% by the end of the year, doesn't mean that prices are going to fall. This just means that they're starting to increase less quickly. And of course, as we move past February 2023, which is going past the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when prices, particularly energy prices, started to shoot up, by definition, we're going to see inflation come down as we start comparing to that higher level in 2022. So let's all remember that when some people try to take credit for the fact that inflation is starting to come down during 2023, which we're definitely going to see happening. There has, of course, been the monetary policy response that Douglas mentioned, and we've seen 10 consecutive rate rises, the last one last week, and we all know now that rates are at 4%. The market expectations and the latest set of forecasts by the Bank of England are for the bank rate to peak at 4.5%, which is much lower than expectations in November, which were for it to peak at 5.25%. So the markets think it's not going to peak quite as high as before. Interestingly, though, I think in the commentary the Bank of England released, they've signalled quite significant concerns about core inflation. So that is inflation that's generated not by energy or food prices, which have been quite volatile, and food inflation in particular has been very high in recent months, and we all know what's happened to energy prices. But this is core inflation, which is driven by services, sort of more domestically generated inflation, and that's being driven in part by our very tight labour market, and they're signalling continuing concerns about that. So that's where they're worried that inflation is going to become embedded. So if they continue to see that rising, it may be that they take a stronger stance to rate rises than the market are currently expecting. It is clear, though, from voting intentions that the panel, the MPC, are softening a little bit in their willingness to raise rates. So it'll be interesting to see what happens at their next meeting. So as I mentioned, and has already been mentioned as well, we've got a very tight labour market in the UK and in Scotland. Unemployment remains at that very low level. And whilst vacancies have fallen back a little from their highs in the summer, they're still at near record high, apart from the highs of last summer. So we've still got, a vacancy for every unemployed person, which is a very sort of high rate comparing vacancies to unemployment. So there is this concerning rise in inactivity that we've seen across the UK. And there are many potential reasons for that, but there's definitely a rise in inactivity due to ill health and disability, which is obviously a concern. And we've seen that reflected in some social security payments, i.e. that there's been a rise in claims which are related to ill health and disability, which is obviously a long-term fiscal concern for the government. So in terms of our outlook, we have revised down our forecasts slightly from the ones that we published in October. Now, the last one we published in October were finalised before the mini budget happened and all the turmoil that happened around that. And it may have been if we produced another set of forecasts in November or December, they would have been worse than this. So our outlook for the economy worsened quite significantly, and then has maybe got a little bit better given the stability that's been introduced since October and November's events. But we are slightly less positive about the outlook than we were then. And in terms of the pathway, standard comparisons to other forecasters, and obviously we've got John here from Fiscal Commission, and we can talk about their forecasts. We are a little bit more positive about growth than them, but mainly that's due to the fact that we've got more data because we've done it later. So we know more about what's happening in quarter 3 and quarter 4. So we think that the recession will start in quarter 1 and last for 3 quarters before we return to growth in quarter 4 of 2020. The bank are still much more negative than this, although they are forecasting quite a shallow recession now, and around 0.5% contraction in 2023. They're still forecasting a contraction in 2024 overall, and then returning to only 0.4% growth in 2024. So that's much more negative in the medium term than the OBR are about prospects for the UK economy. And it'll be interesting to see how the OBR's view has therefore evolved, because the sort of fiscal headroom that the Chancellor's likely to have at the budget in March will be very dependent on the OBR's view of the prospects for the bounce back after the recession ends. So, as I said, we focused very much in this commentary on our reflections on the Scottish budget events. And it's fair to say, I think, in a way, that the headlines that were generated were quite a lot focused on the income tax changes. Now, this shows the kind of distribution of Scottish taxpayers and how it's changed over the years. One thing I would remind everyone of is that not everyone earns enough income to pay tax in Scotland. And in some of these years, it's as high as 45% of adults who are not in income tax. It's lower as we go into sort of 23, 24, because lots of the thresholds are frozen and therefore more people are brought into tax. So in 23, 24, it's around 39% of adults who don't earn enough income, essentially, to be able to attract income tax. But what we can see in terms of the structure, because of freezing thresholds over the subsequent years, is that more and more of the tax base in Scotland who are liable for income tax are now in the higher or additional rate parts of the income tax distribution. So the threshold in the budget were frozen. So if you look at out to 26, 27, which the SFC forecasts go out to, you can see this fiscal drag, as we call it, bringing more and more people into tax and more people into the higher bands of tax, which actually earns the government quite a lot of money compared to uprating those bands by inflation. They were all frozen except that the Scottish government mirrored the UK government's decision to lower the additional rate in the UK, top rate in Scotland band to 125,000. That was expected that they would mirror that, because, you know, sort of why wouldn't they? And politically, it was quite an easy decision for them to do so. Other changes were more surprising, I think, and you know, we weren't necessarily expecting. So the higher rate was increased from 41 to 42p, already 1p higher in Scotland, now 2p higher, and the top rate was increased from 46 to 47p. So overall, this was estimated to raise 129 million, with threshold reduction we've already talked about. I think it is quite interesting that the change from 46 to 47p only raises £3 million, which in the scheme of the Scottish budget is essentially negligible. Now, this is about the SFC's view of what sort of behavioural response we may see to a change like this. And so perhaps John will want to cover that, because that's been it's been the source of lots of discussions, both at committee, but also as discussing with journalists and so on, trying to understand the sorts of behavioural responses we're talking about here, and what actually might happen in practice, and whether we'll actually ever know what the level of behavioural response actually was. There was also an increase in the additional dwelling supplement. So this is a supplement to land and buildings transaction tax, the stamp duty replacement in Scotland, for second properties. This is quite a significant increase, but ABS is mainly concentrated in certain parts of Scotland, as you would expect. So we're seeing it mainly in Edinburgh and the Highlands, places where we have more of an issue with second home purchases. But in the SFC report, there's some interesting analysis of how much of those second homes may be, disincentivized for buying as second homes, and it might be that primary purchasers buy them instead. So there's some interesting analysis in there, so that this doesn't quite raise as much as you would expect, because there is some, again, behavioural response to this tax going up. I'm going to finish just talking about a little bit about social security. You can see it in the budget, and it's been through the resource spending review as well, that the Scottish Government are setting out a clear priority to ensure that they spend money on supporting people through social security payments. So a combination of the introduction of new benefits like the Scottish Child Payment, a different approach on disability related benefits, such as the Adult Disability Payment, which is replacing PIP. So the Scottish Government would say it's a kinder approach and a client-focused approach to ensure that people are claiming the benefits that they are eligible for. And overall, across the UK, we've seen an increase in claimants in general, as I've already mentioned, for disability-related benefits. So all of these things are combining to see a huge increase in what's been spent on social security over the next few years. And this is in the face of the budget overall generally not growing. So what we're seeing is social security forming a much larger part of the Scottish Government's budget going forward. And where this is not matched at the UK level, what we're seeing is that the payments that are being made will outstrip the funding that's been provided by the UK Government to reflect the fact that these benefits are now devolved. So basically this deficit, if you want to call it that, this net position that we've shown here, has to be met from elsewhere in the budget, which means non-social security areas, and particularly non-social security and non-health and social care areas, are being increasingly squeezed in order for the government to prioritise these payments instead. So just finally, before we move on to get our thoughts from our panel, there were some questions that we felt weren't answered, both in the budget itself, but also in the subsequent committee appearances by the Deputy First Minister and so on. So there wasn't much detail about how much the National Care Service is going to cost in the next financial year. The Deputy First Minister gave some figures at committee yesterday, but it's still quite uncertain about how much that's actually going to cost. And obviously, with lots of opposition parties focusing on that as a way for the government to save money potentially, it would be good to know more about that. There'll be a new financial memorandum that will be introduced, which should give us more answers on that. But little in the budget about it, unfortunately. There wasn't a public sector pay policy for 23-24 published, and there was also no details on the plan set out in the resource spending review to reduce the public sector workforce to pre-COVID levels in order to keep a lid on the public sector pay bill. There was no detail about how that's going to be done or managed, and whether it is actually going to be done. There was also in the resource spending review, it was promised that there would be lots of plans for public service reform in order to deliver public services in a more efficient way, given the tight fiscal constraints we have. There's been no more in terms of a plan on public service reform published. There's been, to some extent, the usual argument with local government about whether the settlement has been fair, how much the Scottish Government are asking local government to do with the funding that they're being given, and how much control local government really have over local decision making, given the financial constraints that have been placed upon them. And the most recent example of that is obviously if local government are looking to reduce teacher numbers to be able to meet their own budgetary priorities, then the Scottish Government are saying that they're not able to do that because that cuts across a national priority. So I'd like to see that continue. And finally, since the budget, obviously the Scottish Government have published their energy strategy, and there's lots of other stuff on net zero coming this year, including the new climate change plan. But it's fair to ask the question if net zero really is given due prominence in the budget, given its importance. And we certainly got some doubts about that. So I'll finish there, and I'll invite our panel members, John and Greg, up to give their thoughts on our point.
Okay.
I suppose that's a metaphorically possible coin, which I got. So I'm just going to speak very, very quickly. I think I sort of spoke about 5 minutes. And I'm going to speak a little bit about tax and social security. So the Fiscal Commission, I just jokingly refer to as the Tartan OBR, but what our job really to do is provide independent forecasts of both the economy, tax receipts, and also devolve Scottish social security spending. And that's very much our job. And we do that independent of the government, although we rely very heavily on the government for assistance and also data. I'm not going to talk a great deal about the economy. We produced an economic forecast in December at budget time. It was very much in line with the OBR, Bank of England at the time. Our next forecast is due in May. And as Mary said, a broad sense is that things are perhaps a little better than they were in December, but we'll wait to make see. But our income tax forecasts are based on that economic forecast we published in December. On tax, yes, I think a lot of the real action has been around income tax. Mary has talked about sort of the sort of fiscal drag which the government is building in, the Scottish government is building into its income tax system, freezing thresholds. We estimate that roughly since 2016-17, there's been something like a 20% increase in Scottish higher income tax payers, compared with about a 10% reduction in UK ones. So you can see the effect of that fiscal drag in terms of thresholds there. The other thing which is going on is, of course, that the Scottish government are sort of pushing up the two top rates of income tax as well. There has indeed been a lot of conversation about behavioural effects. Very happy to talk about that in more detail later. I think perhaps just illustrate how large these are. So just going into that sort of figure that Mary sort of put on the screen, the top rates went up to 47p in the pound, an increase of 1p. In static terms, so without behavioural effects, that would have raised 34 million. Our estimate of the behavioural effect was 31 million negative, so a net effect of plus 3 million. So you can see that basically practically all the tax increases were wiped out by behaviour. Now, those behavioural effects are really uncertain, particularly those ones on the higher rates. Our estimates are in line with OBR, IFS, HMRC work. They're very uncertain though, and what we do know though, that there's pretty strong international evidence across many countries that there are these sorts of behavioural effects. Quantifying them is hard, but they are there. I think one thing to think about in the context of Scotland is the net income tax position. So if you remember the horrors of the fiscal framework, horrors in the sense it's very complex, no fiscal position intended at all, it's very, very complicated. So what happens? Basically, the Scottish government gets its receipts from its income tax powers, and then the Treasury knocks off a block grant adjustment. So this is basically to compensate for the fact that Scotland can now raise income tax. So the important thing is to look at the net income tax position. We do this. We estimate that roughly, if you think of Scottish income tax policy and UK income tax policy, how that's changed, you generate an extra £1 billion since devolution of income tax started. So since 2017-18, the Scottish government have raised an extra £1 billion through their income tax changes. On the assumption, it's important, on the assumption that the Scottish economy performed the same as the rest of the UK economy. Unfortunately, the Scottish economy didn't perform as well as the rest of the UK economy. And the actual, we estimate the actual sort of net position is about 325 million. So you can see that quite a big gap between what they could have raised if the Scottish economy had performed as well as the rest of the UK and what they actually did raise by their income tax policies. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other key thing to keep in mind is that this net position is very, very sensitive. So if you happen to be the finance secretary, so Kate Forbes, as I guess, will be coming back. So if you happen to be Kate Forbes next December and you're thinking about sort of your budget, the net position on income tax is really, really sensitive to assumptions. So if we estimate that if we increase our earnings forecast by just 1%. That would be an extra 200 to 250 million on the net tax position. So it's a hard thing that the Scottish government face here. Quite a volatile net position, and one which is incredibly sensitive to the economic assumptions. And I think the other thing, but they have to work with that. The other thing they have to work with is reconciliations. Now that's even more complicated than the fiscal framework. So I'm not going to talk about it, other than to say reconciliations are basically catching up with the budget actually set on the basis of economic forecasts, both ours and the APRs. And then when the income tax data comes out 18 months later, you basically have to just pay catch up. What was the real position as compared to the forecast position? And that's called reconciliation. These numbers vary a lot, between about plus 50 million and minus 309 million. So that's quite a big range. Even more worrying for Kate Forbes for next year is that we are currently forecasting that reconciliation as basically minus 730 odd million. So almost 750 million worth of reconciliation. And that's a tough pressure to build into your budget. Okay, that's income tax. Social Security, just very quickly. Yeah, I'm okay on Social Security. So what's going on with Social Security is that we're estimating that, or forecasting that the expenditure is going to increase pretty dramatically. It was about 3.6 billion last time in the current fiscal year. Next fiscal year, about 5.24 billion. By 27-28, 7.27 billion. So that's a big increase in social security expenditure, in part driven by increases in inflation. That's sort of okay, because if you think back to the terribly complex fiscal framework, there's a block grant elements of this, and for most of the sort of devolved social security payments, things like the replacement of paper disability payment and child disability payment, there's actually part of the block grant comes because the UK benefits are upgraded, and therefore the block grant is higher. The problem comes though for the payments not covered by the block grant. So if you look at the net position on social security, for next financial year, 2024, we are estimating the net position is about minus 194 million. But the Scottish government have also introduced a number of their own payments, which have no parallel in England and the rest of the UK, and therefore no block grant. That's going to cost them about 580 odd million. So we estimate that next year there's going to be the Scottish government have to find about $750 million to pay for social security payments on top of the money they receive in the block grant. That number increases by 27-28 to about $1.5 billion. That's pretty large. And therefore, that implies pressure on Scottish government budget and some pretty difficult choices. So I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, John. Greg, some thoughts?
Sure. I'll be as quick as I can. My name's Greg. I'm from the Resolution Foundation in London. We're a think tank devoted to improving the living standards of people on low and middle incomes throughout the UK. I'm not going to go into the details of the Scottish fiscal framework. I sat up late last night trying to wrap my head around it, and I started with a full head of hair, and now look at me. So I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why we should all worry more about growth rates than tax rates, right? So as we just had explained to us, there might be between an extra 300 million and an extra billion from the higher tax rates, income tax rates that are levied in Scotland. So that's maybe between 0.6 and 2% of total revenues, if I've got my maths right. So reason 1 is that this is small compared to the already 7% higher public expenditure in Scotland than in the rest of the UK, largely because of the Barnett formula. So it's really important to put this in perspective. You know, in London, when people see higher tax rates and see better public services in Scotland, they kind of make a link between the two, and that link isn't as powerful actually as it seems, because some of the money doesn't come from the higher tax rates. The second reason is this behavioural impact, which is people trying to shift their incomes or not working because they're facing higher taxes. So some of these behavioural responses are just the size of the economy stays the same, but it gets shuffled around a bit to avoid tax. But then some of these behavioural responses really are people working less, producing a smaller economy, we're going to need to worry about those. And that brings me on to the third reason, which is like, does everyone realise how awful the growth situation is in this country? So if you look at the last Bank of England monetary policy report, they say that in the decade before the Lehman crisis, the economy grew at an average of 2.75% a year. 2.75%. The decade after the Lehman crisis was 1.75%, right? And the bank is now expecting that basically the first half of this decade is going to be just 0.75%, right? So from 2.75 down to 1.75 down to just 0.75. Now, you know, is this a big number or not? Yes, it's a big number. Let me tell you why. The difference between the economy growing at 0.75% and 2.75%, yes, in 1 year that's 2%, but in 5 years that's 10%. The Scottish economy could be 10% bigger if it was growing as quickly as the UK economy did, like in the pre-Lehman crisis period. That means, other things equal, 10% more revenues, right? So that's an extra 5 billion quid for the Scottish government to choose how to spend. And these are huge sums that could make differences, massive differences to all the things that the Scottish government, you know, rightly cares about. And there are some big bits of growth policy, things that matter for growth, that aren't competencies of the Scottish government. So international trade has just got a lot more expensive, hasn't it? And that is not something that's a devolved responsibility. Corporation tax has been gyrating, and that also matters a lot for growth, more than maybe some people seem to think. Maybe not in the way that some people seem to think, but it does matter, and it's not something, unless I'm wrong, that the Scottish government is going to be able to change in the short run. But there are things that the Scottish government can, should, and will hopefully do to boost growth. And I'm just going to mention two. So the first one is adult skills. We live, you know, very long working lives now, and you know, many other countries are much more ambitious than any of the countries in the UK are about equipping people for their careers as they change over their lives. And we looked at, you know, labour market inactivity. We've also looked at instances of low pay. The way to fix that is to give people the right skills so that they can, you know, provide for their families and pay taxes. And then the second one, and this is a bit nerdy, but also very important, is land use. What do I mean? I mean planning. I mean planning for housing, and then planning also for business assets. About half of the investment in the economy is in structures. So you need planning to build a structure. And so we think about regulation, we think about hiring and firing regulation, or regulation in product markets. But actually the land market in all of the countries in the UK is extremely highly regulated. And as far as I can tell, much more tightly regulated than in many other European countries. So looking again at the land use system, not just building more housing, but also building labs and factories and offices and logistics units in the right places, in reasonable time, no more 10-year delays. If we fix that, then the Scottish economy, the whole UK economy, could grow faster, and then there'll be more revenues without the need for higher tax rates.
Thank you very much. Very interesting contributions from our panel. And this is the things you're mentioning about, it's sort of looking at transitioning skills and also taking new economic opportunities. It's very live at the moment in Scotland, particularly about grasping the opportunities that are associated with transition to net zero. So I think that's really relevant to the economic challenges we have. So I'm going to pass over to Emma now, who's going to manage our Q&A.
Yes, I'm in charge now. So. And Hannah's going to help out with the roving mic, so I'll let Hannah get in position, and I'll just take some questions from online. But actually, I'm going to go first and ask my own question. So I'm interested in how we found this year in terms of the transparency of some of the information coming out of the budget. John, you're in a position where you get some of this information before us. I don't know if that makes you privileged or not, or it's just you prefer not to. But in terms of how Scottish budgets operate, often we do have problems with some understanding some of the facts and figures come out, and I'd be interested to hear your view, Greg, on how that works in terms of UK as well, and how do you find it working at that level, and how important actually is it? So I'll start with John.
Okay, transparency. I think it's really important to start this one off by actually giving the Scottish Government a lot of credit for what it's done so far. So I remember the days back in 2017 sat in this tumbling sort of decrepit building with Mary, and she's working in the Fiscal Commission.
Just to be clear.
And you know, the budget documentation was not at all transparent. I think it's made enormous steps forward, and I'm really pleased by that. And I think in part that's due to people like the Fraser. It's also, I think, having an independent fiscal institution as well, which helps. But also, I think the civil service and also the finance secretaries have been clear that they want to be transparent. So there's been a big improvement in transparency. I think there are things in the pipeline, for example, publishing the budget on a COFOG basis. So that's basically saying using a sort of internationally agreed categorization of expenditure rather than these funny sort of portfolio titles which change every month. And it's very hard to follow exactly what's going on. So that's, I think, an important step forward. I think the government deserves credit for that as well. I think there's been increased transparency too over what used to be called SOFA money. So this is where, how does the government sort of close the budget? So often the government, certainly in the days before the agreement with the Greens, the government had to negotiate deals with the other parties. And there's always a sort of bit of money for that, and no one was terribly transparent about that. I think that has been improved enormously. I'm getting lots of detail on that. I think there are still issues. I think one issue for us is that the budget, the Scottish Government presents the budget in this way agreed with Parliament, which is basically at the, they compare the proposed budget with the budget bill from the previous year. But actually what's happened is during the course of the year, you've had switches in expenditure portfolio composition. And also if you have consequentials during the course of the year, additional consequential, you don't catch up. So I think that leads to enormous confusion, and I would like to see them do something about that as well.
Okay, so yeah, transparency isn't just for anoraks like us, right? Transparency, we've seen this recently. Transparency has huge and real consequences for the actual economy. And we saw in September what happened when the government tried to sideline the Office of Budget Responsibility. You know, the markets took fright, the pound plummeted, interest rates shot up, they fired the most senior civil servant in the Treasury. And I think this brings home to everyone that it's not just a luxury, when you're trying to borrow money from the markets and you're trying to operate in international markets, people who are lending you money need to know what you're doing. And if what you're doing is sensible or at least defensible, then transparency provides no harm for that. And I think we all realize now that, you know, there are thousands of people in this country who lost their houses because of the hopefully temporary loss of transparency that the government experimented with in the latter part of last year. And hopefully we've all learned our lesson not to mess around like that again.
Yeah, I would agree that I think the experiment, as you put it, in September, has solidified and emphasised the importance of institutions like the OBR and how important they are in the process, which I think has been really important actually. And I'm sure the Fiscal Commission are glad about, you know, the value that is recognised from these institutions. And I think the Fiscal Commission has been part of improving the transparency of the information that Scottish Government put out, and also what the Fiscal Commission put out through their reports, which is, you know, a lot of detail, and we're able to have these discussions about things like behavioural effects because of the amount of information that you publish on how you approach things, which I think is really important. I agree with John, though. I get increasingly frustrated by this budget to budget comparison rather than a comparison of the current budget proposals that have been set out compared to what the latest funding position is for the financial year that we're currently in. I think that becomes less and less tenable as the budget becomes more complex. And it was set the scene for the argument between the Scottish Government and the local government to a certain extent, because it was very different depending on whether you looked at what the local government had been given to the best of our knowledge for 22-23 at that point in time, as compared to what had been in the budget the previous December. So I don't think it's very defensible anymore to say this is what we've always done and this is a convention, therefore we all. I think, you know, at the UK level, they seem to manage to see this is our current knowledge of what we spent in this financial year. These are our plans for next financial year, and have those sorts of figures set out on a co-fault basis so everyone can see what's happening. I think that's what the Scottish Government should be aiming for, because it's much more transparent.
Could I just add that we actually do publish that? So in our very long report, if you know where to look, which is in our fiscal commentary, we actually publish the sort of the current position as we understand it in terms of the budget's funding compared with the next year's proposal. So that information is available. The government do have it as well, because they give it to us. So I don't think it's too much for us to go and actually publish it themselves as well.
Great. Okay, we'll take a couple of questions from in the room. So question here. Will you mind just waiting for the mic and then tell us your name and if you're here from an organisation, that'd be great.
Is on? Can you hear me remotely?
If you just speak, they can.
Yeah, they can.
Okay, fine. Okay, my name is Gareth Morgan. I'm just here as an individual. I'm involved in the charities campaign on equality issues. I'm not an economist by background. I just wanted to ask about the behavioural effect that I think all of you spoke about between people paying Scottish English tax rates, and I don't really want to bring Douglas in on this as well, because I assume he advises people affected by this. Do you really think there are lots of people deliberately switching their tax position from Scotland to England? Because if you're a PRI taxpayer and you've got a house in Scotland, you've got to go to a lot of work to shift that, and there doesn't seem a lot of anecdotal evidence about people doing that. Are the behavioural effects more linked to the other things that hit wealthier people, such as the withdrawal of the child benefit above the higher rate threshold, and then the withdrawal of the personal allowance to 100,000, and then there's stuff about people in public sector pensions being hit by the pension charge when they get over certain thresholds? Is it those thresholds that are hitting people more? Because I think some of those lead to some incredibly high marginal tax rates, if I'm right.
Okay, we'll just take one more question from the floor. Thank you. There, again, just
Frank Burchuk from the Department for Leveling Up. My question is, so if we look at the OBR's forecast for inflation, they're ultimately saying that after 2024, inflation will drop below zero. So that's the equivalent of saying to the Bank of England that they've overdone it in terms of rate rises. And my question is, what's sort of the Scottish Fiscal Commission's view on this, and what does that mean for growth in Scotland? Do they share the OBR's view on this?
I'll let John think, and we'll start with Mary on those two questions.
Yes, on the behavioural effects. I mean, the sorts of adjustments that the Fiscal Commission make for behavioural effects are the different effects are many and varied that sort of make up that overall adjustment. The evidence so far that's been looked at since there was the big changes in tax regime in Scotland in 2018-19. HMRC with the Scottish Government have done some evaluation work on this, is that there is not evidence of people switching like actual migration, so switching their sort of domicile in order to avoid this higher rate of tax. But there are lots of different types of behavioural effects, as has been mentioned. So people, choosing not to maybe work as many hours. There's a certain degree potentially of tax motivated incorporation as well, which people can look at. All of these other effects that you mentioned, as people move up the income distribution, will also have an impact on people's responses. So these different things that have been introduced, but these things are UK wide that you've mentioned. Whereas obviously these are additional things potentially in Scotland, and that's sort of the interest here. To figure out what the behavioural response might be. It's also different, given a lot of the evidence, and John can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the evidence that's used to make these adjustments is about income tax generally, and not just non-savings, non-dividend income tax, And one could say, as you have said, that that's much more difficult potentially to sort of move around. So these different elements, but there aren't good academic studies on the particular situation of Scotland being part of the UK with differential tax rates. So the SFC and others are using the best evidence that's available at the moment, but it is very uncertain who big these effects are. We know they exist, but actually quantifying them is really tricky. So it is quite difficult.
Could I chime in a little bit of recent experience? So, in my note and what John and Mary have said, definitely the erosion is not all about moving. That is a small part of that concern of people moving. Of course, if someone does move,
then you lose all the tax, not just the increment of differential rates. At a personal level, I'm concerned about impacting growth. So not all that changes. If someone changes from an incorporated, from self-employed to incorporated, vice versa, to change their personal tax position on that investment, they can still be contributing to the economy, employing people, and so on and so forth. So the two are different. At an individual level, I want Scotland to succeed and grow, and if there is a disincentive to people coming up, which I think is easier, it might happen than the difficulty of people untangling themselves and moving solely for a tax rate difference, that would be trouble. So I really, yeah, I think it's a difficult balancing act to get that revenue raising and fairness with the behavioural of welcoming people who will be doing jobs, some will be leading jobs, some will be leading businesses, and we want that in Scotland.
Can I just respond? This is a counter effect of that. I've got a lot of anecdotal evidence about people who've moved up to Scotland, partly because
Sorry, can I just respond? I think there's evidence, at least anecdotally, of quite a lot of people moving from England to Scotland because they respect higher standards of public services and quite happy to pay a little bit more tax.
And that's certainly what the Scottish government would say, you know, that people look at obviously more than what income tax rate. If you look at maybe what council tax rate they would pay, which is lower in Scotland, they would look at the provision of public services and all these sorts of things. So that's certainly what the Scottish government would say in response.
I think it's important though just to think what this exercise is doing. I think Maria's already hinted at this. So what this exercise is doing, it's asking a question, and it's asking the question: what is the effect of an increase in the top tax rate by 1p? It's not asking the question, you know, are public services better in Scotland? Do we have more rainfall in Scotland, which is great to get into sports? Or do you particularly like deserted beaches, which are there many fantastic ones in Scotland? It's not asking those questions. It's asking a very specific question. And there is quite a lot of strong evidence that that does matter. It's very hard to pin it down exactly. So what we've done is we've looked at UK evidence, what the IFS, HMRC have done. We've looked at the HMRC evaluation, 1 year's worth of data that Mary mentioned. We're not overly impressed with that because it's just 1 year's worth of data. We're waiting for HMRC to actually develop a panel and therefore allow us to track behaviour over time. But we've done things like we've looked at American data. So you have two adjacent states, America, with different income taxes. What can that tell you? And if you look at some of the European data, I think, let me just get this right. I get it wrong, but Germany, Switzerland, where you have different income taxes again in sort of adjoining neighbourhoods, you can start to get these effects as well. So there's lots of data around showing there is an effect. What's actually tough is to sort of say exactly what that effect is. And you know, that's the sort of thing that the Scottish government has to worry about. The other thing, just on this argument that both Greg and Douglas made, yes, of course, what matters in a sense is the underlying growth rate and the impact of these sort of tax changes on those underlying growth rates. But don't forget that Scotland is the devolved country, it has a fiscal framework, and it doesn't get any benefit from an increase in, it doesn't get any direct benefit for an increase in sort of in dividends. So if you shift, so if the response to the increase in Scottish income tax rate is to shift your income from sort of salary into dividends, that's a loss for the Scottish government. And the Scottish Government Finance Secretary have to balance their books, not this sort of hypothetical thing for the whole of the UK.
I'll come back to you just on Frank's question in a second, but Greg, do you want to add anything about some of those other changes, some of those other threshold effects in
Yeah, so we just very briefly, what we've ended up with in the UK is a very kinky tax schedule, haven't we? And there's a new one, which is the payments that go to people for the cost of living who are on universal credit. They get several £100 extra to manage this year, which is like a great thing. But the minute your income goes £1 over, you lose all of that money, right? So actually that extra pound means that so your tax rate's over 100%, I guess. And kind of when we're thinking about who pays the highest marginal tax rates, there are pretty high marginal tax rates at the bottom, but there are also some islands, if you like, of high tax rates elsewhere. And I think we need to, when we're trying to do well-intentioned things like give people extra money to deal with the cost of living, we need to not trap people in benefits at the same time by accident.
And John, anything points on inflation or possible deflation?
Our inflation forecast follows the OBR, so it's applied to that one. Not permanently, but on the narrative forecast, it's our judgment. The OBR forecast makes sense. Yes, the OBR forecast does sort of go negative for a small amount of time. That does mean that, yes, prices will fall a little bit, but overwhelmingly, basically inflation goes up a hell of a lot and then down. And that's a really important point, and I don't really worry about all that. It's not terribly important.
Perfect. Okay, so a couple of questions online that we'll take just now. So I've got three that are around kind of the outlook for the economy. And so one is kind of short term, asking about, do we know anything about the impact of the strikes and how, well, affordable is the word that's used, but interpret that as you will. One asking specifically about Scotland's low level of business investment, often thought to be a primary cause of low growth and low productivity. So what are the prospects for business investment? And then a third one, trying to, cheer us all up. Are there any signs of optimism over the medium term in the Scottish or UK economies? So take your pick, and I'll start with you, Greg.
Okay, so yeah, business investment. This is one of the things that I've been working on a lot, and I do think it's extremely low throughout the United Kingdom, Scotland included. There was a recovery, and this is a problem that's been maybe 20 years old. There was a bit of a recovery in the early part of the last decade, and then something happened in 2016. Any ideas? And basically, business investment flatlined since then. It kept growing in our neighbouring countries neighbouring those in the UK, and it fell in the COVID pandemic and hasn't quite come back. This business investment is, I think, crucial for growth. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's a really important thing, especially when the population is aging, maybe shrinking, or at least not growing as quickly as it used to. And what can be done about it? Well, I've talked a little bit about corporation tax, where I think what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng had in mind was, they were trying to use something they had under their control to boost business investment. It wasn't the cheapest or most efficient way to do it. Instead, what you want to do is you probably want to cut tax on investment. So you want to increase allowances, I would say, rather than reduce the headline rate. And we've been kind of going in the opposite direction. And it now matters a great deal more now that our headline rate is higher than it used to be. So the distortions that arise from taxing investment matter more when the headline rate is higher, like it now is. Then I've talked a little bit about land use. I'm also interested in the way that companies in the UK are run. We've seen that UK equities are now held by people all around the world, and pension funds in the UK have largely divested from UK companies. They mostly hold gilts, especially these old defined benefit programs. They're closed, they're winding down, and the role that asset managers used to play in kind of encouraging management to do the right thing, invest for the long term, I'm not sure that's being done properly anymore. So I would look at reforms to corporate governance to help owners and other stakeholders, maybe workers, support management to do the right thing over the long term.
Okay. Come to you, Mary. Any of those three?
So on the glimmer of optimism, which we get asked a lot because we seem to be talking about doom all the time.
Quite right.
Yeah.
We're economists.
Yeah. Our latest business survey, despite a difficult end to 2022, we do see quite a lot of resilience in the Scottish business space, to be honest, and that people are thinking that maybe it'll be all right and they'll sort of get through. They are expecting a bit of a pickup compared to 2022 and their overall kind of turnover and sales and so on. This was an aggregate. Of course, it was more positive for larger businesses and smaller ones and things like that. But so that was quite heartening and encouraging. But what wasn't great, like to the business investment point, was the outlook for business investment and export activity. So these sorts of things, which are more likely to point to the increasing our productive capacity in the medium term, were much more negative. So maybe the business space would kind of muddle through, and the difficult time is going to come in the spring when energy support is rolled back. But there wasn't a lot of sign of confidence to invest. On business investment as well, one thing, not to get too statal about it, but it is very difficult to properly measure business investment in Scotland as well. Data like this is generally collected on a GB basis. So actually knowing how much business investment is going on in Scotland is actually really difficult. So that does hamper us in understanding how Scotland is performing relative to the UK. Although, even if we're keeping pace with the UK level, as Vic says, it's really not that great internationally. And there is that clear divergence that we saw in 2016 due to that sort of wider uncertain environment. On the strikes one, that's, I mean, I can see from a economic measurement point of view, and the way that output of various public services or things like train services is actually counted, that the loss of activity on particular strike days probably will have a direct impact on how much output's actually being generated in these services. And in terms of the affordability of meeting different pay claims, obviously the government is in a difficult position here, and they don't want to give them to one set of workers because they know what it will mean for other sets of workers potentially. But at the same time, the Scottish government have made choices here. They are choosing to spend more money on particular things. They chose, for example, we didn't really mention business rates or council tax or anything, but they did choose to freeze the poundage on business rates. Now you might think that's the right thing to do in a very difficult environment before you enter recession and so on, but it's a choice, and it cost them, £200 million to do that. But that is the choice they made to do that. So there are choices here that the Scottish government have made in a very constrained fiscal environment. But I will, I would expect, just from a kind of technical measurement point of view, that when you have a loss of activity for some days on end, that it is likely to impact on the overall economic output generally.
And John, how does that sit in terms of thinking about macro forecasts, but also in terms of things like being able to forecast what the public sector pay bill might be? How does it's something that wasn't in the budget as it usually is, and what are what the reasons for that, if and what are the risks there?
I think the public sector pay policy was, it would normally the government includes a sort of statement of the public pay policy in the budget, and this year they decided, I think, it decided not to do that, which provided a slight headache for us. So we basically had to put our own assumption in, and we did that, and we sort of marked up public sector pay by a small amount. And there is some sort of feedback from that onto sort of income tax receipts, but it's quite weak. So and I'm sort of slightly nervous about that sort of assumption, because I'm particularly, given the sort of this obvious strength of sentiment in amongst some public sector workers, I think our assumption is probably quite low, but that's probably one of the difficulties in forecasting. I didn't get the sense from listening to John Sweeney's evidence to the Finance Committee that he's totally keen on these policies. But,
Can I just say something quickly about public sector pay? I don't think in the long run the government has a huge amount of latitude or choice in this matter, because people can choose in the long run whether to work in the public or the private sectors. And so it's no coincidence that over the very long run, pay in the public sector roughly keeps pace with pay in the private sector. It's because people can choose. And so really, once you take that as a given, the government needs to decide, do they want to have higher taxes or less spending elsewhere, or smaller public services?
Right.
Not great.
Can I just add as well, there's another transparency point here about understanding what the public sector pay bill is on a regular basis. There was a number published in the resource spending review for the £22 billion, and it's not always clear. I think the government should publish much more information about this on a regular basis, so people can understand what proportion of government spending is going directly onto public sector pay.
It'd be great to take a couple more questions in the room. So we've got, two right at the back on the other side of the room. You can pass along there and we can make it work. And so we'll take both your questions and please just tell us who you are.
No, right. Richard Curley, Queen Margaret University. I was struck by the points you raised, Mary, at the end of your presentation about the matters not discussed, not even referred to in the budget. One of them is public sector reform. But that's usually code, of course, for reducing the number of people who work. Now, Kate Forbes made it explicit, fewer people working in the public services. What I've always observed is that the most effective way to have fewer people working in a particular institution is to allow those choices to be made at a relatively local level. What we're now being told is you will employ more teachers. We will decide this from St Andrew's House, and the councils will respond and say, well, we may do that, but we will employ fewer planners, thus causing difficulties on planning. We will employ fewer street cleaners and we'll employ fewer people working in recreation and leisure, all of which is the story of the past 10 years, actually, a vast, substantial increase in education spend and dramatic reductions in all the other spends in local government. Could you give a bit more thought on that?
Oh, that's an interesting angle. My name's Esther Roberton and I'm here as an individual, but as it happens, I happen to chair FAI's Cultural Trust and can only echo the point that Richard's made. My question was actually a kind of bigger and longer term one. I was really interested to see the social security graph that you showed, Mary. I've spent a few years being involved in health boards, and one of the things that's astonished me has been the huge increase in health spending proportionate to everything else. And I've just made the very same mistake I asked people not to make, because of course it's not health spending, it's spending on the health service. Yeah. And the sense I've got, and I'm curious to know on the spending side, who, if anybody, is doing any kind of medium to long-term forecasting, because spending on the NHS and spending on social security is actually spending on failure demand. And one of the areas that gets hit is local government, and they're the ones that would be spending on housing and education and all the things that might prevent people ending up in the health service. And the evidence is that much of that spending is on illness that is absolutely preventable. On the income side, I'm really interested that we still focus on income tax. There's been a lot of work, and I read a report recently by Heather Macaulay, who used to work in Scottish Government, about the range of tax powers that currently exist right now in their constitutional settlement that would give us the flexibility to raise money in all sorts of ways, including through local government. And I'm not sure if that's the Fiscal Commission or Revenue Scotland's role, or whether it's Fraser of Allander, but I'd be curious to know if anybody is doing the work on that income side as well as on the projection of the expenditure side.
Well, I can start with the plug. On 22nd of March at 9:30 in the morning, we're publishing a set of projections about public expenditure and Scottish budget over the next 50 years. So this is our fiscal sustainability work, and it includes projections by portfolio, depending on demographic factors and on GDP. So it's a start of looking at these very long-term trends in Scottish budget and Scottish public expenditure. So it's a bit of a plug. Some people are doing some work on this, but you have to wait on the break.
I'll take the sort of public service reform angle. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's quite. I mean, obviously, in the resource spending review, it set out that you know, there's probably a need to manage down the size of the public sector workforces. They said, and that's at that stage to pre-COVID levels. Given a lot of the increase in the public sector workforce over the course of the pandemic had been in health, it wasn't then clear where those people were actually going to and certainly it wasn't forthcoming from the Cabinet Secretary at the time, nor the DFM since. And you know, whilst the principles for public service reform got set out in the resource spending review, the Deputy First Minister, when at committee after the budget had been presented, was basically saying no, there was no plan for public service reform. So budgets were going to be just squeezed, and then we'll sort of, it was more of seemed to be a sort of salami slicing exercise as we've sort of seen in the past. And I think it is a good question to ask about teacher numbers. You know, that's a manifesto commitment for the Scottish Government, so I can understand why it's important to them. But you know, given the projections in Scotland for the numbers of children we're going to have in Scotland, you know, it's a reasonable question to ask, well, why? Why is that such a sacred cow? If what we're likely to need is much more invested in perhaps maybe the social care system or other things. And I completely agree that another thing that cannot be touched is this, the NHS budget or the health and social care line, even if spending in other areas would reduce expenditure in the medium to long term. And that's what this government is supposed to be about, outcomes and ensuring that we shift money to preventative measures in order to spend less money on harm reduction. So I agree that this is the sort of talk you get, but that's not, you don't see that reflected in budgetary decisions, in which too often revert back to the manifesto pledge or the health spending line, rather than what that money is actually achieving. And so I can only agree with what you both said.
Yeah, it's very difficult for them to be able to put a figure on what might be the preventative spend savings further down the line. And I wondered if you got any insights on that, Greg, in terms of how, you know, what kind of evidence is required, and you know, maybe we should be investing in to kind of help us understand that. I mean, it's not something you can just come up with overnight.
I think the quickest payback would be to better integrate health and social care, isn't it? So it's one in
Yes.
but like across the UK, I mean,
Yeah.
we've got 1 in 7 beds occupied by people who don't need to be there. And so you know, some of these chronic health conditions are going to take, they're very complicated, they're going to take years to solve. Of course, you know, you need to start now, but it seems like there are some quick wins. Of course, the labour market is very tight. It's very difficult to find people to look after people when they come out of hospital.
Yeah, no, it's something that's been it's trying to make that happen in Scotland for a number of years, and for various reasons. It's worked well in some places and not in others. But
why not? What hasn't worked?
Well, I think it's partly because it was introduced at the start of, or towards the beginning of the period of austerity and financial issues. You know, when there's not a lot of money around, it's quite difficult to do big reform. I think that was part of the problem. But there are some good examples of places that people feel it is working. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting one. Okay, so got a couple of questions just online. We've got about 5 minutes left, I think. Yeah, 7 minutes, like. Okay, so just a couple in terms of big picture stuff, actually. But you know, actually, we were told the budget was about net zero and about tackling poverty. So you know, what else needs to be in the budget? Or thought about for the next budget, for example, to ensure that net zero actually feels like, you know, there's something in there that takes us on that track towards net zero. And similar for poverty, and we've got child poverty targets in Scotland, which are very ambitious, you know, and often it's quite hard to see that read across between the budget priorities and those targets, even if we're told at the start of the budget document that that's exactly what the priorities are. So interested to hear thoughts on how you go about, you know, convincing us next year that that those targets are, you know, integral to the priorities the government's following.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot for the government to do to draw that line more explicitly between the decisions that they're making in the budgetary document and how that's contributing towards these broader aims. Because I think it is very difficult to see that, and it was really start reading it about not just net zero and child poverty, but also this ambition to make public services sustainable, which was another one of the priorities. And so the fact that there was nothing about public service reform, you know, was pretty unbelievable, to be honest. But you know, I think the government does need to do more, and others like Audit Scotland have said this in the past, to demonstrate how the decisions that they're taking are actually likely to achieve the sorts of targets, the really challenging targets they have for things like net zero. And you know, that should be part of the formulation of things like the climate change plan, and really understanding how are we going to get from here to over there, and what is the pathway for that. Because at the moment it looks really difficult, and all we can say, and all the Climate Change Committee have said, is, you know, there's no way these targets are going to be achieved because the government isn't taking the sort of transformative action it needs to in order to achieve those targets. So I guess, setting statutory targets isn't enough. That doesn't make things happen. The government needs to make the decisions and show how those decisions have been formulated because they are likely to achieve the outcomes that they're interested in. And I think the government needs to do much more, whether it's its internal processes or whether it's about how they communicate that, or both, to demonstrate how the decisions that they're making, both in a budget, but hopefully over a longer period of time, actually contribute towards those aims.
Yeah, just very briefly, the UK welfare budget is actually pretty big in international comparisons, and yet we have quite a lot of poverty, quite a lot of child poverty. And it takes me back to 2016 when George Osborne said, we're going to cut benefits and we're going to raise the minimum wage because the best anti-poverty strategy is to have higher, fewer people on very low wages. And I can kind of see where he's coming from. I think it's great that we've got a high minimum wage, but the fact is that the minimum wage is not a very good anti-poverty strategy, and that's because lots of people, a lot of the people in very poor households aren't earning, they either don't have enough hours, or they're not on the minimum wage at all, or they've got extremely high costs because of housing or because of lots of kids. And to go from like low wages to low poverty, you need to have enough hours, and then you need to, then there's this big issue about the way families are structured, where in the UK it seems like we have more like fewer nuclear two-parent families than in many other countries. And that's a really difficult kind of sociological issue. And without kind of blaming anyone or saying that there's a lifestyle choice or proposing how to fix that, family structure is one of the main determinants of child poverty. So I guess what I am saying is that even though we've got quite a high benefits bill already in the UK, probably the most direct route to reducing it, if you can't change things like family structure and extremely high housing costs, is a high benefits bill still.
And John, you get the final.
I'm going to take a real check on that one. Can we do between them?
Oh, well, on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for being here in person. I can't say how good it feels to be back in front of real people, but also great to have everyone online, of course. and apologies for the sound issues we had at the start. I'd like to say thank you to our three panelists, to John, Greg and Mary, and could we all give them a round of applause?